we go. Okay, Gerald, you're up.
Thanks, Malcolm. Okay, as you can see, it's um, conceptualization, creation, and construction on the cheap. I've built quite a few layouts now, actually, and I must say I've always enjoyed doing the scenicking part of them, and it's partly because I've learned things along the way. I've experimented with things, and I've also um, had access to a lot of mental pictures, and my work has taken me all over the world. I've seen mountain scenes, I've seen valleys and deserts and this and that, and I have a sort of a memory that is kind of pictorial. So I take a mental photo of a piece of landscape, and so when I start thinking about where my train is going to go, a whole bunch of these pictures all sort of come into the foreground of my mind and say, well, okay, that's the way the train's got to go, and that's what it's got to look like. Next slide, please. Um, I have used a number of illustrations. Many of them obviously are from my own layouts, but where I didn't take a picture at the appropriate time on a layout that's subsequently been destroyed, I've borrowed from others, and I appreciate everybody who has always allowed me to take photographs of their layouts. And I hope some of you may recognize some of these and figure they look pretty good. Thanks. Next slide. Okay, there are a few things that you really need to have decided before you get into basically buying anything. Although I'm sure by the time you decide you want to have a model railway, you've already bought some locomotives and you've already got this and that. But um, the first question you obviously have to decide is it going to be permanent or portable? And that then spills over into, is it going to be prototypical or freelance? And there are degrees of freelancing, and I guess there are degrees of prototypicalness, right? How much so do you want to be the absolute perfectionist, the rivet counter, or whatever you want to call them? And then how much do you have a mental picture of what you want to do before you actually go and buy a piece of plywood or build a bit of bench work or whatever? How ambitious are you? Many people don't, just basically think that there's no way they could make anything like some of the layouts they may have visited. In reality, pretty well anybody can do almost everything. And if you can't do it yourself, if you get into a group of model railroaders, you will always find people who are prepared to help, people who've got ideas, can point you in the right direction, give you hints or whatever. So, it is a fraternity, and take advantage of it, and give back to it as well. Do you have predetermined starting points? Obviously, you've got to decide at some point on what scale are you going to model in. Now, if you've already bought that expensive brass locomotive, then that scale was fixed for you. But if not, you probably should think a bit more about the gross concept before you fix it, run down into the scale. So deciding on scale is really the number one priority, but that's part of the decision on what it's going to be overall. So that's conceptualization. Next slide. And here's just a couple of examples, permanent or portable. The top left image was a portable O-scale display at the Manchester Model Railroad show that I visited 6 weeks ago now. and that is 15 feet long by 2 feet wide. I think it was three 5-foot modules joined together. And, it's O scale, but it gave a fair amount of switching type running for large O scale locomotives. And it was a nice layout. People had a lot of fun with it. On the other hand, if you want to run trains in a real live scenario that represents long distance Canadian traveling, then something like the Holmes Club layout, which was built in Hamilton, and this was obviously taken quite a few years ago now, is a totally different ball game, scale, cost, time to build, so on and so forth. What you're looking at in that picture on the lower right is only one arm of several arms in the large room that it's hosted by. And God knows how many hundreds of feet of track there are. And this is an HO layout. Right, next slide. Prototypical or freelance? Again, let's go to extremes. The picture on the upper left, Reg Laprise built this lovely N-scale layout of the Algoma Central Railroad. And for those of you who have been on the Fall Colours passenger trip at one time north from Sault Ste. Marie, you will have gone over this dam. It's the Montreal River. The dam was built after the railroad was built, and the railroad initially went across this valley on a steel trestle bridge. And the steel trestle bridge essentially was encased in concrete by this dam. And Reggie's details of all of the penstock pipes, the discharge pipes and everything is perfect. I don't know how many trips he made there and how many photos he took, but anyway, it was great. On the other hand, bottom right, the Toronto O-Scale Club, when they were in Hannah Avenue, I'm not sure if I spelled Hannah correctly, but anyway, they were semi prototypical. They had a fictional railway in a real environment. Most of the scenery and scenicking was pretty realistic, but then they would play the time period. So there you had the railway was essentially a transition area, 1950s, most of the time. But then somebody brought in this hydraulic crane, which was only invented in the 1980s, to build this super duper new steel and concrete bridge. So there was a bit of a dichotomy of ages there. So is that really prototypical, or is it freelance, or is it a bit of both? Next slide. But keeping in mind, you're building this for yourself primarily, unless you're part of a club group, and you can do whatever you want. There's nothing to be criticized for if you don't make it the exact prototypical detail. Going back to my previous comments about mental pictures, these were just arbitrary sort of pictures of real life images that I pulled up. The top left, the BNSF trestle that goes across Lake Penderay. That is a very simple bridge to build if you want. It's just a series of concrete piers and girders from one to the next. They're all the same size. You can build it with a few purchased cast piers and some micro-engineering rail girders if you're building in HO or N scale. The tunnel on the right-hand side was of interest because it showed you that, in fact, the tunnel portal is only really half a portal. The right-hand side is buried in the hillside. So if you've got a flawed portal, or if you haven't got much space, it doesn't matter. You can squeeze it. You can wiggle it in. And then on the lower left, this dates way back to the 1890s, so it's technically black and white. That was just to show fairly more typical, no ballast, sort of just track work on flat ground with structures over the track. Next slide. So now, having talked a bit about concepts and stuff, what are your ambitions? Do you want to build a super layout? Do you want to make this something which is going to win all of the prizes and all of the competitions and become one of the places that has to be visited if there's ever a layout tour? Is operating an important part of your modeling dreams? Many people who are builders, detail scratch builders, all they're interested in is the building, and once you've got it completed, then it no longer has the same level of appeal because you haven't got those challenges of doing the building. But if you do like operating, then do you want to operate with a group? Do you operate by yourself, or both? And then, of course, another question you have to probably should ask, although you don't need to, is what is the life expectancy? If you're in a rental condominium, you're hoping to move, upgrade to a house with a great big basement, ready for a larger layout, then I would say you've got a short life expectancy. So you should probably build a layout which is movable, which is modular, which is essentially a bit of a portable layout. Are you a perfectionist, or are you primarily a collector? Do you really just want somewhere to show off your gorgeous overland brass model on a piece of track? So lots of things to think about. Once you've made all of those decisions, then you can move on. Next slide.
Oops. Sorry, I've got a freeze here.
Oh,
Is that the next one?
yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, if your collection and passion is long unit coal trains, they're incompatible with a 10-foot by 12-foot third bedroom unless you're modeling in Z scale. So you need a starting point that helps with providing your vision of the layout. And if you're a neophyte, learn as much as you can before starting to build, basically because it saves you money. You don't end up with a bunch of stuff which you can't use or which you adapt to allow yourself to incorporate them. Predetermine any of the key questions and decide right up front the space available, the scale, the minimum radius, the purpose, and the operating system if operating is going to be a big part of things. I stress minimum radius because in all of the layouts I've ever built, I've always found that however carefully I established a minimum radius, 34 inches for HO or whatever it might be, I always ended up with somewhere where things wouldn't fit, and I had to squeeze in a 26-inch radius curve or something. And if you do that, 26 is still okay. You can get everything around it. But when you start getting down to 21-inch or 18-inch in HO, then you'll find you've got some rolling stock and maybe some locomotives which aren't going to go round those curves without a little bit of nudging. So to keep that in mind. And also, don't forget, if you're going to have a double track main line, if you want to keep it with a minimum 30-inch curve on a curve, then that means the curve on the outer double track line is not going to be 30 inches, it's going to be 32 or 33-inch radius. Otherwise, you're going to be forced to make it below that minimum that you set. Make sketches. It's easy to make sketches. If you haven't got computer programs, actually, quite frankly, don't use computer programs. Hand sketches with pencil and a simple ruler are much more effective, and you can do them much more quickly, and you can rule out a lot of the things that are most obviously going to be wrong or not work. Things like curves, for example. And then the other question that you need to address at some point is, does the scenery provide a backdrop to the railroad, or is the railroad in the scenery? I've got a couple of pictures, which I'll go to next, please. Oops, sorry, before we get to there, here's some examples, right? The bottom area, there's a sketch that I made of one of my layouts on the modules. It's not perfect, but it works. It achieves everything you need to do. It allows you to check whether the tail tracks are long enough to allow you to have a locomotive plus a caboose, for example, or whatever you might need. And then the picture up on the right is a topographic map of the area that I was planning to build a model of. And I was only really concerned with that little triangular junction area and the little branch line off down to the south and the one that goes wiggling up to the north. But it gave me what I needed to know in order to conceptualize how to lay out my layout. Yep, next one, please. Okay, so now we come back to this business of, is the railroad in front of the layout or is it in the scenery? And here's a lovely example from Keith Stamper's railway, where you're looking up this canyon, and the railroad is behind that set of cliffs. And actually there's a Y, because there's a second track even behind that, and then there's another series of cliffs behind that. So this railway is really within the scenery. And if you're going to take a picture of the train running through it, it's totally in the real. Next slide, please. So here's a couple more of these, in the scenery. These are from one of my layouts, my ON3 model of Anyox, which some of you may have seen. Picture on the left, there's a river, comes down from the mountains. It's got a little bit of a pond here, and it's surrounded by tag alders, and it's very, very overgrown. And there's a low culvert type bridge with a track going over it. And then behind it, there's another much higher up the mountain railway, which is going over on a trestle, which you can barely see through the trees. And then behind that, you've got on the backdrop, you've got the mountains. And that's a nice little scene, but it means that you're not going to see the train fully all of the time. And if you like the trains to be within the scenery, then that's the way to go, in my opinion. Picture on the right is also good example. Again, you've got water, you've got some cliffs, some outcrops along the water's edge. Then you've got some trees, some scrub vegetation. Then you've got the tracks, the power line and overhead catenary. Then you've got a road, some buildings. Then you've got a forest rising up the hill behind it. And ultimately you get into the hazy higher mountains. And you're really not quite sure where the flat ends and where the backdrop starts. Is it the second set of mountains, or is it the first set, or is it somewhere in the middle of them? And to me, that's very pleasing when you can look at a picture and say, I'm not quite sure where that board came down. Doesn't matter, because what you want is that total effect of seeing a piece of the world rather than just seeing a railway track with a picture behind it. Next slide. On the other hand, and this is no criticism of Dave Woodhead, this was the only slide that I had that was immediately handy. Here you've got the tracks right at the front, and then you've got the landscape evolving up behind it. Go around the corner, and Dave's railway goes into the scenery as well. So this is also very good because it shows you one of the interesting variations in ballasting. This is a branch line, it's not a main line, so it doesn't have high quality ballast. The ties are variably exposed. Some of them are completely buried. There's piles of rocks which were too big, which have been tossed aside. The dirt, it's essentially dirt rather than ballast. And that was typical of the branch lines of the much older age period. Slide, yes. So then another thing you also want to think about is, and this really only applies if you're making a permanent layout, are you going to build a single or multi-level layout? If you've got a whole room, you're almost certainly going to use a multi-level approach because you've got the space, you've got the desire to build a much longer piece of scenery. If you decide that it must be a multi-level layout, then there are a few things you really want to watch for. Are the gradients between the levels part of the scene, or are they hidden? Which basically means, are they in a helix in one corner of the room? If you have to have a helix, don't go cheap on the radius. Make it as large as possible. And minimum 26 to 30 inch radius is the sort of number I would strongly. Otherwise, it becomes even more important to make sure that you've got access to inside of the helix, because otherwise you're inevitably going to have a derailment at some point, and you're going to have to get in there to either fix the derailment or fix the track that was causing the derailment or something. I wouldn't suggest going any steeper than 2% as a gradient, and I would suggest that whether it's a helix or whether it's a hill within the landscape. Switchback zigzag railways that can go up a mountainside are very effective and provide some fun operating if you're in the mood to run short trains. When I say 2%, that's essentially 2 units vertically for every 100 units horizontally. In other words, 2 centimeters every 100 centimeters. If you're using a scale rule, it's pretty easy to do that. Just buy one of those 36-inch steel or aluminum rulers and cut a couple of wooden blocks that are 2 centimeters high to prop it up on. Next slide. Okay, so now we really get into scenery, right? It's essentially, what is scenery? It's everything you add after building the benchwork, laying and foolproofing the track, and installing the wiring buses. So everything you conceptualized previously now comes into play as part of that scenery. So for the rest of this discussion, I'm not going to talk about lighting, except to a very, very limited extent. partly because it's a whole topic in its own right, partly because it's incredibly expensive to do a sophisticated lighting system. And it's also something which needs not just a dedicated room, but also a room where you can basically rip out all the standard wiring that was installed in it and go back to putting in your own right from the fuse box. Next slide. So, a couple of simple rules for scenicking. Put in the backdrop first, and work from the back forwards. So you may not want to complete the backdrop because obviously until you get the foreground hills in, you don't know how low down on the scenery the topography has to be painted relative to the sky. But you can do the basic painting and reduce the amount of work that has to be done when you're leaning over a lot of other already built material. Same with the topography, rough in the topography, particularly if it's a hilly scene, and get it generally formatted. Then, having done that, you want to complete the track. That's ballast, culverts, bridges, weeds, signals, signs, etc. And always double check clearances for the longest wheelbase equipment that's going to run on it, whether it's a coach, a long freight car like an auto rack or something, or a locomotive. Then add the details to the topography, rough in the roads. Don't forget to install the street lights or the wiring for them at an early stage so you don't have to drill through everything afterwards. And then add the buildings or add the wiring for the buildings. And if you're going to put in buildings, make sure you paint the insides of them black, particularly near the bulb. And if it's a cardboard building, then double check that the black paint, put a light inside it, and just make sure that it doesn't diffuse through the black paint and look weird. Then finally, you get to the point where you're adding people and animals and graffiti and junk and gravel and so on and so forth. And then as part of that final part, I always believe that you should have the eye drawn to a mini scene rather than the whole. You want people to look at little features rather than a great big 3/4 of a room. Right, next slide. So backdrops, let's talk about that. Basically, thin board. You can buy it very cheap from Home Depot or any of the other hardware stores or lumber construction do-it-yourself stores. I think most of them. I certainly Home Depot. If you need it cut to a particular size or width, then usually they will have a free cutting service for a limited number of cuts, and it's well worth taking advantage of that. I've always believed in painting my backdrops for several reasons. One is it's the cheapest way of doing it when you buy commercial paints. And secondly, I think it looks better because gluing on pictures is, firstly, it costs you money to get a picture printed. And secondly, you need about 3 people to hold that piece of print paper perfectly level and flat and drop it down onto the glue so you don't end up getting wrinkles or creases or something. I've ruined a couple of backdrops by trying to glue them on with just myself and and trying to anyway, making a mess. Then once you've done that, then you move forward and get on with things. Painted backdrops can be done by amateurs. Couple of ways. Firstly, if you're building an urban scene, all you really need the backdrop to be is the sky. So it could be simply a pale blue, could be pale blue with some whitish spray painted on blobby areas representing clouds, or it could be, a bit more with darker blue on one side and lighter blue on the other side. So I find if you go to a hardware store or a Sherwin-Williams or something and go and pick up paint chips and one liter of paint will last you a long time and it'll do a lot of paint, and it's an awful lot cheaper than buying modeling type paints. If you want to buy spray paints, also don't buy from a model store, because you can buy bigger cans at a lot cheaper price if you go to somewhere like Michael's, or if you go to Canadian Tire. Now, I discovered something in Canadian Tire. If you go to the paint department, all you get is the sort of standard spray cans, a yellow, a dark blue, a light blue, a black, a grey, a silver, a red, and a couple of other colours. If you go to the automotive touch-up paint section, you can get every conceivable shade of any colour you want. And they're really quite reasonably priced. So that's you don't forget, if you go to Canadian Tire, there's two areas where you can buy spray cans. And if you're lucky, you'll find that they've got some discounted. Carry the paint down well below what you think is going to be the join line to the scenery, because it may not ultimately be the join line. And if something does move, fall, collapse, shrink, whatever, it doesn't leave a glaring gap in the color or the hole. When you get to topography, there are two methods generally. There's either you build it up with styrofoam and then carving the styrofoam, or you use hydrocal with sort of fabric, I guess you could call it, wetted and draped over either chicken netting wiring or crumpled up newspaper or something like that. That typically has been the way that the historic experts did it. I find it very frustrating, very expensive, and far less adaptable. And also, you end up with this very thin skim of plaster of Paris embedded in fabric over newspaper crumpled up. If you then want to install a tree, typically you drill a little hole and put a drop of glue into the hole and push the tree into it. With a piece of hardened hydrocal, which is only about half a millimeter thick, the odds of the tree staying perfectly vertical without a lot of props and a lot of glue is almost impossible. So if you use styrofoam, you can drill nice little holes into it, and they hold their shape, and they hold the tree, they hold power line poles, sign poles, you name it. So styrofoam is my preferred method. Next slide. So I've I keep coming back to this foreground versus background, but now I want to point out, you don't need as much detail in the background. You can get away with a lot of cheating, a lot of poorer quality trees, for example, half buildings rather than full buildings, etc., etc. Buying scenic items versus making. Well, depends on the size, depends on the cost, and there's a balance, right? But in general, if you're building a reasonable sized layout, you're going to want to plan to make as much as you can. And there's a lot of things you can do to make this easier and help you. For example, find out people who have built switches beforehand and borrow their jigs if they've got them. Borrow molds from people who have made rock cliffs and tree stumps. There are molds for those as well. Forced perspective is another thing. Overly steep hills look a bit funny. But at the same time, you need to do a little bit of excess steepening in order to give the impression of topography disappearing into the background. People will classically show you how they used an N scale house up on the hill and an HO scale house down beside the railway and say, look at my forced perspective. That sometimes works. There are other times when it just does not work at all because really the scale difference is too much and the spacing is too close. You need things to be gradual always as much as possible. Next slide. Here's a good example of this is from my HO layout, which is now mostly dismantled. The backdrop was entirely painted by me. The backdrop includes most of the hills. It was based on photographs that I took out in Alberta in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And I was reasonably happy with it. It was you could say it was a bit of a French impressionist type daubing, but it was done mostly with fairly low cost. The water soluble paints that everybody uses nowadays. I never use oil paints, and except if I'm doing something like a super detailing on a locomotive. And then the two railway bridges are both obviously in the foreground with the topography built up around them. And the foreground one, which was a fairly typical Canadian Pacific bridge, I modeled the piers actually on the Humber River Bridge in Toronto, where CP was a classic railway for always reusing an older bridge, and as you needed to make it bigger or stronger or double track instead of single track, you just added to the piers. And so if you look in detail, you'll find that every pier is slightly different. And I had great fun making that. And whereas the one in the back, which ostensibly is the Burlington Northern Railway, is a purchased through truss bridge with hydrocal cast abutments on each end. And you can get molds and you can make multiple abutments out of one or two molds. The piers on the bridge in the foreground were actually made with the same molds as the ones in the background, but I just glued the two halves together to make a freestanding pier. The other thing you will notice in the foreground bridge, see the silver line running horizontally across. If you look at any or every railway bridge these days, there's actually a conduit going across it, which carries a fiber optic cable, which is a communication system that the railway rents out to one or other of the big three cell phone companies across the country. And so it just adds a little bit of super detail to the bridge. Next slide. And if you're going to do winter, why not? There are several people that I know of where if a layout goes through more than one room, they will have a different season in each room, which I think is a great idea, a neat idea. And I find that this is it's particularly interesting, this one, because again, where does the backdrop finish and the topography start? And I will tell you that the backdrop doesn't end at the boundary between the blue and the white. It's a little bit nearer in than that. And so there are always opportunities to make things different. Next slide. So if you're into, when you get into the topography business, are you going to make it flat, hilly, or mountainous? Do you want to have water? My personal recommendation is keep the water to a minimum. It's not easy stuff to get in a very good effect with, and it's also an expensive thing to do. Towns mean you need roads, utilities, lights, and the period becomes fixed. Whereas if you're going through rural scenery, you can have it any period pretty well. You can run your steam trains, you can run your transition area diesels, or you can run your modern alternating current units. Does the railroad run through or have traffic sources and destinations? Is it a point to point, or is it a one that's you're going to watch a train go past you? Are there going to be tunnels or large bridges? Is it double or single track line? Whatever it is, it must have culverts. And this is almost the most failing grade of a greater number of layouts than almost anything else. Next slide. And if I've got them in the right sequence, oh, no, it isn't. I'll explain in a little while. This is a couple of shots from Home Depot, and I want to, on the left, white glue. You're going to use a lot of white glue. My suggestion, buy the big jug from the bottom, near the bottom, but also buy one of the smaller ones with the dispenser cap from the top, and then save the big jug. And when the little one is almost empty, refill it from the big one. That way you don't have to keep opening the lid of the big one too often. The glue doesn't dry out. When you want to mix up some diluted glue to firm up your ballast, for example, then you can just pour straight from the big jug into a mixing bowl of some sort. So if you look at the prices, if you can see them, buying a big jug of glue is way, way cheaper than any other way of doing it. And you can use white glue for almost everything. There's a couple of areas I'll mention later on which you can't. You don't need to buy hydrocal or expensive fancy plaster of Paris. Again, you can go to Home Depot or whatever else you go to, home hardware, and you can buy 50-pound bags of molding plaster, as you can see in the palette on the top right. If you lucky enough, you'll find that they actually sell molding plaster not just in white, but in a grey colour and a sort of a pinky colour as well, pinky brown. And if you can get the grey or brown one, that's even better because it gives that topography when you finished working with it and covered it with plaster, it doesn't show as a glaring bright white colour. Next slide. Um, if you are going to go with the styrofoam, so not using styrofoam, but you want to do plaster covering crumpled newspaper or whatever, then you're going to need to buy plaster cloth, which typically comes from somewhere like Woodland Scenics. And if you go to a store today, you'll find that little price tag says 15 or 16 bucks on it. And you need an awful lot of bags of it to do much in the way of scenery. Somewhere many years ago, I acquired this other brand of Mod Rock. I suspect that dates back to about the time when, if you had a broken leg, you had a plaster cast put on, and the hospitals always had bulk packs of that material available. But nowadays, they've all gone to fiberglass and long gone. Next slide. Here's a start of laying some track. And there you can see there's a plywood, essentially, base to the frame. Then there is a slab of styrene glued down with white glue onto it. And then, in this case, I used to use cork, but then cork stopped being available because the environmentalists said that if you cut the cork off a tree, you'll ruin the ecology, which is actually rubbish. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But you couldn't buy cork. And other people also always used to use Homosote. Now, I don't know if any of you have used Homosote. It's half-inch thick compressed paper, and it can be cut and carved, so you can make a graded, sort of elevated portion for the track. But because it's paper, anytime you use a water-based glue on it, you wet the paper and you distort the material. And if you're working in a basement and you have changes in humidity and temperature, Homosote expands and contracts with moisture change, and obviously with temperature change as well. And almost anybody and everybody who uses Homosote has problems with track buckling and gaps in track and so on and so forth. So if you can't buy cork, or even now that cork is available, it's only available in those strips to go under the track itself. It doesn't come in big sheets to use in yards or under switches. So I discovered that if you went to your local carpet installer, he would sell you sheets of cork, which they put underneath things like linoleum in kitchens. But they couldn't buy it either when the ecos went mad about cork. So they discovered that you could buy this black material, which is about 3/16 of an inch thick, and it is compressed, recycled, chipped rubber tires from vehicles. And it actually works beautifully. You can cut it with scissors. And if you want to spike down track, if you're using flex track, for example, the pin will go through the tie and it'll grip in this rubbery material. Works very well. And the trouble with Homosote is, of course, that's another trouble with Homosote, the pins don't hold in it. they gradually work out and pop up. You can also glue the track down to this rubber material, but this is about the one place where you can't use white glue, and you need to use that Samsonite or something like that, the stuff that comes in the cans, usually is a sort of a browny color, and you have to glue it. You have to paint it on both sides and then wait 15 minutes and then hold them together. But that stuff works very well. So I just warn you though, when you glue down this black material, if you go and buy it, use white glue to attach it to the styrofoam, and then use the Samsonite to attach it to the track. And if you do that, then you'll have a top-notch bond. Next slide. So I've covered most of what's in this, right? Second point is important. Make sure that the structural members underneath your benchwork are not in the places where you want to put switches, which require switch motors, which usually are mounted underneath the benchwork. So that's an important thing to work with. Otherwise, you've got to use offset switch motors and rods and all sorts of things. Holding down the track, glue or spikes or both. I tend to use spikes until I've got the perfect curve. I've test run things, including trains. Right? And then I'll finally glue it down with the Samsonite glue. And then you can come up with ballasting, and then you can add the features of the culverts and bridges. Next slide. Here's an example of hand laid track, and when I mentioned Samsonite, I actually acquired, I don't know where I got it either, but it definitely wasn't in a hobby shop, this impact glue. And this is like this brown sticky solvent-based glue that I talked about earlier, Samsonite. And the nice thing about this is it comes in a pointed end tube, so you touch each of the wooden ties, and then you glue them onto the rail, and then in turn you glue the ties onto the rubber underneath, and then you hold the whole thing down with weights. And I acquired these sawn off bits of rail track for another reason entirely, never used them. And then when I started hand laying track, I needed weights, and short of going out and finding bricks, which are a bit big, I had these on hand. So I said, oh, they're perfect. And so I recommend anybody getting into doing any sort of cementing at all, get yourself half a dozen heavy weights. If you haven't got sawn off bits of rail, and you won't be able to find them very easily, then bricks will work, or chunks of steel, or anything will work. But basically, 4 or 5 pounds, 2 kilograms is the sort of type of weight you should be targeting for, with a relatively flat bottom. And you'll see on this track that I'm building that I've used the soldered ties periodically. There's one under the piece of plywood there, and unfortunately, those soldered ties are thinner than the wooden ties, so you need to add a little bit of a shim underneath them if you're going to be a perfectionist. Right, next slide. This is a repeat of the previous one. Next slide. Okay, now we want to talk about ballast. And this is actually a real rail line right outside the back of my office in the lesser extremities of the Mimico Go train yard. And there's 2 tracks here, and the upper one was rebuilt some time ago, and it's got a bluey sort of colored ballast, right? And notice the level of the ballast relative to the tops of the ties and the rail itself. The lower track was just rebuilt within the last 6 weeks or so. And this is typical of track laying these days. What you do is you overfill it with ballast right up to almost the height of the rail tops, and then you let it stabilize for a while. You then come along with a tamping machine, and you lift the track up so that the literally about the height of the track, and you tamp down the ballast underneath, and lo and behold, after that wonderful machine has gone by, it'll look like the track on the upper rail there. But it does show you that ballast varies in color significantly all over the place. If you look up at the bank behind the second track, you'll see there's some brownish colored sort of gravelly rock. That was probably the original ballast, in quotes, for the original yard track when it was back in the days of being a CN yard. And so there you've got 3 examples of different colors for track ballast. Okay, next slide. Here's that piece of track that I was hand making previously. This is the example of now that it's been laid. If you look very carefully, you can see where the printed circuit board ties are, and you can see how the ballast comes up to just about the top of the ties, but it doesn't overlap them, and it stops, of course, neatly when there's a culvert or a little stream bridge going across. And I'll come back to this slide later on when we talk about vegetation. Next slide. Yep. So in the early days, if there was no ballast, they just used dirt. Once ballast became standard, the main railroads established quarries and blasted out and created their own material for several reasons. One was that commercially available quarry ballast was screened and crushed to totally different sizes. Typically, concrete aggregate will be plus minus 3/4 inch aggregate size. Ballast for railroads is crushed to what's referred to as -2 inches. In other words, it will go through a screen which has got a square hole 2 inches across. And that means that it'll either be symmetrically 2 by 2 by 2, the chunk, or it'll be an elongated piece with a maximum length of maybe 4 inches on the long side if it just happens to bounce through the screen pointed in first. The railroads like freshly blasted rock because 2 reasons. One is if it's fresh, then it's harder and has more fresh angular faces. And good ballast needs to be angular and to allow the bits to lock together, but leave gaps between them so that there is good drainage. So they prefer what's known as trap rock or diabase, diorite, dolerite, volcanic rock rather than limestone. Limestone's too soft. It tends to crush on the corners, so you lose the sharp edges. CP has a very large quarry near Sault Ste. Marie. Interestingly, before they opened that quarry, they used to use slag from the Sudbury smelters, which was actually the perfect type of ballast for several reasons. It had the sharp angular edges, but because it was almost entirely quartz, it was very light, so it was cheaper and easier to transport over longer distances. And if you look along the Sudbury main line, almost probably as far as White River, several hundred miles west of Sudbury, you'll still find some Sudbury slag ballast, although mostly after slag was deemed to be a hazardous toxic material, and the railroads were not allowed to use it again, they didn't remove it, they just covered it up with clean rock above it. But if you scratch down through the clean rock, you'll find some of the slag underneath. So for modelers, if you want 2-inch fragments in O scale, that proportionally means you need a piece of grit that's about 1/10 of an inch across. In HO, 1/20th of an inch, or about 1 millimeter. And obviously for N scale, you want to go to half of the HO scale. So that's the type of material you're looking for. If you go to a hobby shop, they will sell you tiny little bags, which will do all of about 2 feet of track, and they won't have enough of the same color for you to do 20, 30, 40, or 50 feet of track. So you'll end up getting frustrated. Next slide. But you don't need to do that. If you need a lot of ballast, which you will if you're going to use if you're making a room-sized layout, then you can find grit a lot more cheaply in multiple color variances from a variety of sources. Firstly, you can go to Michael's, and Michael's, if you wander around at weird times of the year when they haven't got a special on Halloween or something like that, right? You'll find that they will sell funny sort of stocks. For example, they might have literally a 5-pound jar of grit, which people use for making flower arrangements. But it's perfect for ballast. Alternatively, the best grit you can buy if you want HO or a bit bigger, you look at roofing shingles on houses, they're all covered in ballast. That's perfect grit. If you go to a wholesaler that sells pallet loads of shingles to the trade, and there's one on the Queensway, for example, for those not the Queensway, on Evans Avenue, for those of you who live in Toronto. Those suppliers will sell 10-kilogram bags of the grit off the roofing shingles, so that when the roofing shingle guys have to do corners or angles or something like that, and they want it to look the same as the rest of the shingles, they just paint some tar on the groove, and then they sprinkle the grit over it that they bought in the bag. So that's where I actually I have a roofing contractor who works building very close to me, and he always lets me have some excess grit. But if you haven't got a friend, then you can do two things. You can find a supplier, or you can go down in summer, not now, to your local creek in the Toronto conservation area, and you can find on the water's edge on a curve, you'll find some little bits of grit, considerable quantities. Go down with a trowel and one of those large 5-pound coffee cans, and pick up as much as you can.
Okay,
Bring
cool.
it back to your house, and then to the next slide, which I'm hoping is yes. Then if you're in the chemical laboratory business, you'll use the top left side picture. You'll find that you can buy little screens, which are 20 mesh, 40 mesh, and then there's a pan at the bottom. And you pour the stuff into the top, and you shake them, and it falls through, and you end up with the stuff being sorted out to the appropriate sizes. Move to the top far right, and there you've got a coffee can full of this roofing grit from a subcontractor, from a supplier. Go below it, and that's what you find in a creek bed. So in that case, I picked up a lot coarser material because I was going to use the coarser material somewhere else. So far, don't forget, this has cost you nothing for the material. The bottom far left, that was a jar of black grit that I picked up in Michael's, I think for $1.50, or it might have been the Dollar Armor store. And you can either use this as black ballast, or if you want to put coal in the tender of a steam engine, you can use this stuff. It looks more like coal than real coal. It's lovely stuff. And if you look at ballast, for example, in a yard where you had steam engines and they would be recoaled, you would find the ballast along the track for probably a couple of 100 yards beyond it. That ballast has got lots of black coal mixed into the regular rock. So when you're making up the ballast that you're going to put along the track, blend the colors, make a mixture, because it makes it actually more realistic. Bottom middle picture, this was actually another cache from a riverbed, and this was essentially a sand pile, but it was a sand which wasn't just entirely white quartz. It had some iron-rich grains in it, and again, when you sieve it, it comes out, gives you a nice fraction, which was perfect for an HO ballast. And all this costs you nothing. And don't forget, when you pour the ballast and you lay it on the track, you're using diluted white glue from that great big jug that you bought for $16 or whatever it was from Home Depot. Next slide. So that's all the ballasting finished with. Incidentally, I never ballast my switches. You can try masking tape over the moving bits. I just decide I'm going to be unprototypical and be safe. So here's a few more things about the landscape. Some of these I mentioned before, but ensuring that the wiring and the switch motors won't conflict with structural members. That's very important. Don't necessarily feel you've got to do all of the landscape and then all of the trees and then all of the grass. Work on mini scenic areas, partly because you've probably only got enough material for one or two of them, and partly because it gives you the chance to use some of those specialties and to make some little personalized features. And the land surface, you've basically taken your styrofoam, you've used a knife or a hot wire or one or other of the simple methods to carve it to roughly the shape and to format that you need, and then you cover it with a layer of plaster. If you can buy that plaster which is colored, then you have gone a long way towards having soil color as the resultant product. If you can't buy it, or if it's not dark enough, then you've got several other things. You can either buy sometimes in again in a Michael's, for example, you can buy this fine coloring powder, and if you can find brown or gray or black, put a tablespoonful of that into your mix, into your pot before you mix up your ballast. Sorry, yeah, your scenery soil cover. I do something else as well, and that is I have a large bag of sawdust that I acquired from a Home Depot for free. And think about sawdust from a big circular saw. It's not actually dust. It's little fragments of wood, which are maybe 1/8 of an inch long, little grey thready bits. And they actually act like reinforcing rods in that mix of colored hydrocal and or molding plaster that you're going to mix up. And I find that that eliminates the risk of any shrinkage and cracks developing when thin layers of that plaster dry. So think about plaster as being essentially like making concrete, right? Um, the the wood chips are the ballast, the hydrocal, the plaster of Paris, the molding plaster is the cement itself, and the sand is this coloring material. Um, so the other things are fairly obvious: vegetating and installing buildings. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the only slide I've got actually of underneath the layout. And this is to stress um, it. If you're going to build a layout that is more than just about a 6 foot long back and forth type diorama, then make sure you use terminal blocks, heavy enough wiring, and preferably spade lugs or whatever, and jumper cables, etc., so that you've always got a neat and tidy wiring system. And as you can see in my case, I always use red and white as my alternating current power to the tracks. I have a second set of buses which I use with blue and yellow, which provide me with the power to run my switch motors, and a third set which I use for my lighting system. And that's partly because most of my lighting system is a lower voltage than the switch motors, and it's partly because I want to put dimmer switches, or I have put dimmer switches on so that you can have a night day sequencing. So you need to think about your wiring. You don't need to install it all at the beginning. You can always leave the wires from a street lamp on the road above the layout, just dangling down below, and you can hook them up again later, as long as you've got access to the area underneath. And as you can see in this case, I use 14 gauge as my main bus, and then I use 24 gauge as the little jumper wires that go straight up to the track, which are very rarely longer than about 12 inches. Next slide. Okay, bridges. There are actually four types of bridges in my definition. There are bridges that go over the track and bridges that go under the track. And there are also tunnels, which are longer versions, really, of bridges that are over the track. And then there's a fourth one, which are culverts. And again, I'll come back to culverts later. Bridges under the track, they're an integral part of the track work, and they have to be built as part of the track laying. If it's a long bridge, like the ones I showed you in those pictures from way back, you need to build the bridge itself upside down on a piece of 1x2, for example, so that you can get the track straight, soldered together. And if it's that long, then you're going to need to install feeder power wires so that you've got adequate power to not have a voltage drop across the bridge. And then you invert them and you drop them down onto the piers. Bridges over the track, on the other hand, are a scenic element, and as long as the clearance is adequate and the piers on either side look correct, then they can do what you want. Tunnels essentially are the same as two, except that you need to do a couple of things. You need to paint the inside of the tunnel black. You should scenic the walls of the tunnel at least for about 6 inches in behind the portal, and you've also got to decide whether or not you're going to have a fancy portal made out of brick or stonework, or whether you're going to do what was usually typical in Canada. You just started drilling and blasting into a cliff face, and so you had a very erratic edge to the rock. Next slide. So here's another view of those two bridges I talked about earlier, and you'll see here I've now poured the water underneath them. The critical thing about pouring water is you have to paint what it's going to look like underneath the water that you pour. And when you do pour the water, pour it in several thin layers, not in one big thick layer. Otherwise, it doesn't dry very well and it tends to bubble. It's weird, looks horrible, unless you want an ocean with waves and turbulent water. However, if you're only going to pour a thin layer, you need to make a mix up enough, because usually it's two-part mixing stuff. Then you have to make enough to pour a whole complete layer. You can't only have half, otherwise you'll end up with a cliff or a ridge or an edge in it. The picture on the right is a much smaller bridge, and you'll see in this case I cheated to make the areas for pouring the water much smaller. I put a little waterfall in between underneath the bridge itself. So I poured a little pond on one side and another little pond on the uphill side above it. You will need to use clear caulk or something like that to make sure that you've sealed all the edges of where you're going to pour this water. Otherwise, you'll end up with a puddle of water the next morning on the floor of the room, as was my experience once when I first did it. Next slide. Okay, this slide should have been a lot earlier on. The old railways, when they were built, or all of the earlier railways, before environmental laws became governing of everything, the railways always took the gradient of least resistance. And that was almost inevitably going to be up a river valley or down a river valley, fairly close to the water. And if you're going to do that, and this is the Fraser Canyon, so I've taken a bit of an exaggeration. There's the river down the bottom, but there's the railway running along a ledge. And every time it rains or every time it snows, the water, the snow melt on the uphill side is going to have to get to the downhill side of the railway. So if you don't put in culverts, you will end up with a washout on the railway, sure as heck. So when in doubt, put culverts all the way along your railway. Typically, no further apart than every quarter mile. They're easy to make, just a piece of plastic or cardboard, not toilet roll paper, but the cores that come in rolls of tightly wadded cash register tape, for example. You only need to go in about half an inch into the styrofoam, and then you just paint it with a grey colour to look like concrete. And then if you want to pile a few stones above it, that's all you need to do. They're easy to make and they're very simple, and you don't have to have water running through them. They just add and make rivet counters happy. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we come to, once you've got your topography and stuff, are you really making a rural or an urban area? Rural scenes, usually more hilly topography, backdrop is a key part, and you need vegetation. Whereas urban scenes, essentially, you have a vertical backdrop and the rest of it is flat ground with either roads, gravel areas, and buildings that are just stuck there. full or half buildings, and paved roads. An urban scene, essentially, the buildings you choose define the scene. So if you build it in the 1950s, you'll choose one type of building, 1980s, a different type, or 1910, a different type. Rural scenes give you much more scope for imagination. And of course, the number of buildings can be much, much more limited in numbers. And there's much more potential to scratch build the odd few buildings that you need. Next slide. Now, I want to talk first about the urban scene. And again, I'm going to go back to this example. And as I said, it's a flat rail yard and rail track area. And then you've got retaining walls and either half or three-quarter or quarter depth buildings. There's only one building on the right-hand side, which is actually a full depth four-sided building. Everything else is just a backdrop. And they're fairly easy to make. Next slide. Get some photographs, blow them up, get them to sort of the right size, and goes back to my comment about you always have to have a ruler handy, right? And remember, you're working, if it's O scale, then it's 1/4 inch to the foot. So an inch is 4 feet high, a man is 1.5 inches high. Those are the sort of, HO is half that sort of thing. But you can see along the bottom, right? I just essentially found a building, took pictures of three sides of it, and then cut the pictures out after I'd printed them out on my computer printer, and put a piece of plywood in behind the piece on the left center, and then glued ends onto it. And then I built a second one with the solid one with no windows. And did the same with the upper ones as well. As long as you've got a camera and a computer printer, and then scrap plywood that you cut offcuts from the benchwork. Next slide. And the same with these buildings here, right? I found these pictures of houses, and these are on my O scale layout. So they're 2.5, 3 inches high, and you'll notice the trees are getting up to be 6 or 7 inches high. And the one on the left is literally only, probably the piece of board behind it is 1/8 of an inch. The one on the right is a bit deeper than that. Next slide. So for trees, right? Trees can be very expensive. If you want top quality trees, in the foreground, you're looking at upwards of $10 for a 2 or 3 pack, particularly for deciduous trees. Whereas evergreen, you can buy them in bulk. And I do stress, go on the internet and look for the Chinese companies. There's 2 or 3 of them who have distributorships in Canada, and they will sell you bags of 50 or even 100 assorted length trees for quite reasonable prices. And if you're a first-time buyer, you'll get free shipping. Then you can populate that forest in the background area, and then you can just get a few better ones for the nearer foreground area. Or, again, if you're in northern Canada, what do you do when you drive along the highways? Every few miles, or every few yards, actually, you'll find a logged off area, in which case all you need is a few dead twigs and some stumps. And you can buy molds, you can find or you can borrow molds for stumps. Next slide, please. And here's a few examples of trees, right? these were bulk packed cheapy trees. And essentially, I what I tried to do here was to take the eye away from the details and the quality of the trees by putting this hydro corridor through the area, which was just being cut out. So there are some stumps there. They're just building the towers. There's a backhoe, there's a crane, there's a temporary access road that's been built into it. And what you've done is you've turned a forest into a mini scene of detailing of a hydro line. Next slide. Another alternative is, and remember I told you I picked up some grit from gravel from a river bed, and some of it was too coarse. Well, this is where I used it. See this talus slope? There's a cliff at the top there, and then bingo, it's talus all the way down. And it's knocked out all the trees, and whatever few trees are still growing there are just regrowth from an earlier talus slide, which knocked down the rest of those before. And you end up with a very realistic looking scene from out of the Rocky Mountains. And I did use my static grass dispenser for the little bit of patch of grass down on the left and the little bit on a bit of bits of it on the right hand side there. So didn't cost me much at all. Next slide. Alternatively, you can go and buy bags of scenicking material, and the stuff that I like most is the sort of the it's got various names, sort of wool fiber. And it comes in big bags, and again, you can very often find it at Michael's in the craft area, and you can pull a blob out, and you just put a dab of white glue on the ground, and you stick it down. You put you don't need to put one of my big heavy weights. Just put a block of wood or something on it for 24 hours. The next day you come back, you tweeze it up again, and then you buy a can of aerosol, either hairspray or ladies' hairspray or spray glue. You spray over that blob, and then you sprinkle the yellow or whatever color you decide to choose over it. And if you look at this slide, the picture on the plant on the left is meant to simulate gorse bushes, which are very typical in the Cornwall area of the UK. They actually have spikes as well, which you can't see. And they have these yellow flowers and this dark green vegetation. And looks great. But you can also use it for tag alders, which grow in every riverbed, in northern Ontario or anywhere in the Shield. Next slide. This is, okay, on the left, you've got some molds. In the middle, you've got a casting of a bridge abutment, which was made from not one of those molds, but another mold. And on the left here, you've got 1, 2, 3 stumps, all made from pouring molding plaster into these molds. Leave it to set for about 48 hours, and then you invert the mold and it pops out, and then you have to paint it. So that takes a little bit of brown paint and maybe some black highlighting, and then some sort of creamy yellowy paint for the top, for the cut part, unless you decide to make it a much older stump, in which case you can make the top darker as well. But those stumps, you can do two things. One is you can make them much bigger. Look at the diameter of that stump compared to the gauge of the railway, right? That's about an 18-inch tree stump in real life, which means it was a big tree compared to the typical ones that we put on layouts. And so those are a great way of enhancing your forest by not making it forest. Next slide. Here's another example of one of my side hills. There's a mine dump on the left with some of that coarser rock used there, and then all these logs, fallen down trees. They were actually twigs that I picked up in the fall somewhere in some woodland near my house. And again, there's lots of stumps because this was fairly close to a mine. And there's a few little regrowth pine trees. Great. Next slide. Cost me next to nothing. So here's some of the materials that we use, right? Polyfiber is the stringy stuff that you can usually get from Michael's. There's a tube of the spray glue. There's some more of the different colored dusts that you can buy on the picture on the left. Then the picture in the middle shows some of that fine sand that I've used to create a beach, coarser grit above the tidal zone, and then behind it, more of my gorse bush material. And then up at the back, there's a house on the water's edge. And oh, lo and behold, they don't cut the grass. That was static grass, but they did plant some roses. And the roses were the most expensive things other than the house itself. The lower right-hand picture, that was a worker's house. And how do you make two workers' houses, there's one more on the left, into the appearance of a whole line of worker houses? Well, you add elements of indicating that people live there. So the laundry's out on the line. The firewood that's being chopped up and cut and dried for next winter is in the process of being cut and stacked. Little features like that, easy to make from leftover off-cut material, no extra cost, other than the building itself, which I picked up fairly cheaply somewhere. Static grass, if you don't have much of an area, then don't buy a static gun and all of the powders and bits that go with it. They're frustrating. Just buy one of those little sheets of long grass that you can cut up with scissors and glue down. They're made by Nock or one or other of the German scenery makers. If you are going to buy a static system, then buy the one which has the highest voltage capacity. Most of them don't work very well and it doesn't matter whether it's an expensive one or a cheap one, they just don't work well. Next slide. Here's some couple more examples of scenery. Here I've got some fence put in, and the fence along the side of the platform was a real pain in the neck because if you see, I had to cut each section separately in order to step it down the slope. And in hindsight, after the fact, I wish I'd cut the base off the man standing on the platform because I couldn't color match the paint to the concrete on the platform. Next slide. And again, here's some more gorse bushes, some more hillside with the steeper hill doesn't have much vegetation on it. The lower flatter area is a field. It's got some sheep in it, which are up to the right-hand side out of the sea. And because there's all these gorse flowers, there's a bunch of beehives there. And I like the beehives appealed to me. They were one of those little 3D printed devices that you can find sometimes at shows, when somebody's made a bunch of bits and pieces that appeal to them. So there they are. Next slide. And going back to Anyox, and this is rainforest, northern British Columbian coast. So no grass, but lots of tag alder and tangly vegetation where you don't have the trees if the trees have been cut down. So here's the gap between the two branches of the track, which is totally infilled with vegetation. Next slide. Um, duck unders. If you don't need one, don't have one. But if you're looking for a largish layout, you're almost certainly going to need a loop and you're almost certainly going to need a duck under. In which case, do several things. Set the bench height as high as possible, minimize the number of duck unders, um, and install a foolproof electrical power system to the removable piece or hinge piece of track. And preferably also install a dead power zone on each side of the duck under area on the main area of the layout. That way, a train will come to a stop a meter before the brink of the duck under rather than at the brink. Build duck unders as solid as possible, preferably, I think, metal rather than wood. But you don't want expansion or contraction. Thanks. Next slide. So a few hints about electrical wiring, most of which I mentioned previously. If your track length in total is more than about 2 meters, then you will need hidden wiring of a heavier gauge to ensure that you don't overheat or the layout wiring, the train operating system, and burn or blow or something. Preferably invest in terminal blocks. Don't rely on soldering everything together. Even if you're a good solderer, there's always one solder joint that fails, and then it's hard finding it. If you've got terminal blocks, you can just screw or unscrew each one in turn till you find the faulty one. Right, next slide. Most of this I think I've said already, right? Build in circuit protectors for your track power. You are going to get short with several amps, with a DC sound locomotive, could make a bit of a mess of a junction or a joint or a locomotive. If electricity is not your thing, then find a friend to help you with wiring your layout. Next slide. And now we're pretty well close to the end. I like mini scenes. The beer parlor there, the signage, the ladies of ill repute on the upper deck. Then moving to the right, you'll see there's the local hospital, and I found a model of somebody in a plaster cast on crutches. God, perfect for somebody being discharged from hospital with their girlfriend. And then if you go down to the bottom left, there's somebody just coming in their boat. They've been fishing, they've caught a fish, they're holding the fish. Somebody up on the steps is holding their hands out to demonstrate the size of the fish. It's a little mini scene which catches your attention. And then on the right-hand side, there's a bandstand, and inside it, you'll find that there's actually a band, a bunch of people in what I call a jug band, an old banjo and drums and guitar type group. And there's a little button on that, red button on the front there. And if you press that button, it actually plays a sound loop in a loudspeaker immediately underneath it. So they're practicing their music. And That always appeals to the kids visiting, if not to the adults. Next slide. And finally, if you come down river from where the guy with the fishing boat was, you'll see a bunch of seagulls just landed on the river mouth. And if you press another button, the seagulls will start squawking. And again, it adds to it. And they were 3D printed little things, which I ended up painting. If you paint yourself, and once you've bought a bunch of paints, you always have leftovers, so you can always do some more painting. Next slide. Thank you. Wow, been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Lots of great ideas, Gerald. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Walter. Yep. I mentioned Michael's and I mentioned Home Depot several times. And I also mentioned Dollarama. Basically, you need, if you've got one or other of them near you, drop in every few weeks. They always have different stuff. There's always some stuff which is on the sort of the discounted special line. And if it's a pot of grit, it's going to be usable.
Well, that's great.
I do have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I do have a question about your discussion of the sub road bed under the track.
Yes.
I've used styrofoam under most of mine, but the section I'm working on right now, I was thinking of using ceiling tiles. I have a stack of them left over, and I found that I've used them as scenic material in places. I'm not quite sure what they're made out of, but the section that I need, I need something that's thinner than 1 inch of the typical styrofoam. I have tried to cut it, but it's hard to cut it level in that large of a section. But the ceiling tiles seem to work. And then I'm going to be putting either cork or woodland scenic black road bed under it. I am working in end scale. I have used with success latex, that stuff you use in the tube, it comes out of the big gun thing. I've used that to glue down my track. If you get the light brown stuff, you put it down, you push it in, it comes up in between the track a little bit if you get just the right amount, but it does a good hold. On the upside, it is removable if you want in the long run. But what do you think about the ceiling tile as a sub base to build all this on top of a sheet of plywood?
Yeah, very good point. And actually, I didn't mention it when I showed the picture of the styrofoam in Home Depot. There are two types of styrofoam. There's the pink or blue, which is very dense, and you can cut with a knife and you get a clean, sharp cut. There's the white, frilly stuff, which is adequate for insulation. And if you need, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper, but it's almost impossible to cut neatly, crumbles and prills. And if you want to just build a mountain and you need lots of volume, use the cheap stuff. But if you need something which you can stick pins into, use the more expensive stuff.
RPS.
Coming back to the ceiling tiles, I think ceiling tiles are a mixture of sawdust and fiberglass fibers. Yes. And the trouble with sawdust is that it's potentially going to do the same as Homosote. Could swell if it gets wet or gets humidity problem. Yep. So a single tile thickness glued onto as you say, your bench work, your plywood tabletop, is probably going to be okay. I wouldn't start building up too much of it, and then laying track on it, unless I put a layer of 1/4 inch plywood or something down on top of it.
It doesn't hold spikes very
Gerald,
well
it
either.
won't.
Sorry, it doesn't
Gerald, it
hold
won't
spikes
hold
very
the-
well.
Yeah, I just use the spikes to establish the curves, and then I'm using an adhesive to hold the track down.
Yeah.
I don't find N scale tracks hold much of anything.
No. I find gluing is the most reliable way. Yes.
Okay, one more time for one more. Philip, you have a question?
That's not a question, more a comment. Other scenery places, there's a company here in Ottawa called Desserts, which I find has a larger, actually a larger selection of products than Michael's does.
Good.
Yeah, I'm sure every area has different sources.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay,
But,
well, thank you.
It's amazing what you can make. For example, most garden centers, they actually they sell grit and stuff for people who want to do indoor gardens, little boutique things. And at the end of the season, they don't want to keep it over the winter. They're going to discount it.
Yeah, good point. Well, thank you very much, Gerald. I think you've given everybody a lot of information to digest and to take to add to their own layouts. So appreciate the presentation. Thank you. And thank you for everybody to attend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
So good night, everyone.
Good night, Malcolm. Thanks.
Good night.
Mr.
Thank you.
Janko, good evening.